All right, we're looking at the book of Habakkuk, and Habakkuk is really a prophet bringing his burdens to God. He is looking at the state of the nation, and all he sees is wickedness, and so he is wondering, God, why does it seem like I care about this more than you? Why aren't you doing anything? God responds to Habakkuk by saying, I actually am doing something. I'm doing something bigger than you possibly could imagine. But as God begins to describe what he's doing, it's like he makes the problem more difficult, because God says he's going to use a more violent nation, a wicked nation, a pagan nation, to judge his people, to judge the violence in Judah. And that causes Habakkuk to ask another question. And really, it's a question about the character of God. Habakkuk 1:12, he says, Are you not from everlasting, O Lord, my God, my Holy One? And so he's asking God, I don't understand. I don't understand. And so he begins to think a little bit about the character of God. God, aren't you eternal? And aren't you holy? And as he begins to think about the character of God and wrestle with the character of God as he looks at what God says he's doing, that begins to give him perspective. Even as he's asking questions the right way, he's reflecting on the character of God. That begins to give him some perspective. And he says, Are you not from everlasting, O Lord, my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. And so really what's happening here, Habakkuk's thinking about what God said, about how God's going to judge Judah through Babylon. And then he thinks about the character of God, and he says, well, this is what's happening. This is what seems to be happening, but this is what I know to be true about God. And so this is what I know it can't mean. It can't mean that we are going to end. We will not die. And he's just kind of making sure that he's thinking properly, that he's not losing perspective on what is real. And that's helpful when it comes to complaining and questioning and asking God about what he's doing in this world right now. It is important to make sure that your questions actually are true. Sometimes when we complain to God, we're not even saying things that are true. And Habakkuk's like, okay, this is hard for me to process, but this is what I know to be true because of what God's like. We are not going to die. And what does he mean? We as a nation, God still has a purpose for us. God's still going to keep his promise to us. And this illustrates an important principle when it comes to dealing with problems. We have to stop and think. As you look at what's going on in the world, it's not wrong to wrestle and to be burdened and even cry out to God. What are you doing? But as you're doing that, you can't just feel or emote. You also have to think, and you have to make sure you're thinking biblically. Martin Lloyd-Jones puts it like this. He says, most of us have a tendency to talk first and think afterward, if we think at all. But when we speak first, we often muddle ourselves by fanning the flame of our own unbelief or muddying the water of our ignorance. When we shut up and think, we begin to sort things out and allow the light of God to shine into our situation. We're struggling. Part of what Habakkuk is here to do is to teach us how to think, to process the suffering that we see in this world. And one of the first things he teaches us is that it's not necessarily wrong to ask God questions in faith, but we can't just stop with asking God questions. We have to think about what we know to be true. Are you not from everlasting? This is what's true. This is who you are. Restate, Martin Lloyd-Jones says. Next, you need to restate biblical principles. When you start to think, you must not begin with your immediate problem. Begin further back. Apply the strategy of the indirect approach. Such an approach is sometimes of vital importance in the spiritual life. And that's what Habakkuk is doing. This is what's true. God, you are eternal, you are holy, you are sovereign, you are faithful. Those are fundamental principles as I think about what's going on. I can't deviate. It all is going to line up with that. That is what's real. So what is God doing now? What is happening? And he begins to work through what's happening in light of what he knows to be real. Oh Lord, you must have ordained all of this as a judgment, he says. You've established Babylon as a reproof, and they're going to be used to discipline us. So think, make sure you got your basic principles that you're building your thinking on straight, that they are actually from the scripture, that they're actually real, and then apply the principles to the problem. We often look at a problem by itself, and we don't actually apply what we know to be true to that problem. Even still, the answer that Habakkuk receives creates some more questions for him. Okay, God, you're going to use this nation to discipline us, but verse 13, you who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? And basically his question is, but Babylon, I can see that you need to judge us because you're holy, you're everlasting, you're eternal, you're wise, you're faithful, but Babylon's worse than us. How can you use them to judge us? And he looks at the character of God. You're too pure to look on evil. You can't look at what's wrong. And that's an important verse for our theology. But if it's true, Habakkuk says, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? And then he gives us a picture in verse 14 of men like fish. You make mankind like the fish of the sea. And the wicked one, Babylon, this nation, he says, it's like they're going fishing and they're taking captive people for their own good, to make themselves happy. And then, after they're done fishing, what happens is they worship themselves and worship their own power because they are able to use other people and other nations to make themselves prosperous. And this is terrible, he says in verse 17. Is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? God, is this going to go on forever? Chapter 2. Habakkuk says, okay, this is the problem. This is a real problem. I know your character. I know you're doing something, but I'm not sure about how you're doing it. And so Habakkuk says in chapter 2, I am your watchman. And what does a watchman do? A watchman looks out for enemies. But he's not doing that here. He is actually looking out for God. He's like, my job is to be a prophet, and I need an answer that I can give your people. And so I'm going to stand here like a watchman until you give that answer to me. And in chapter 2, verses 2 through 20, God gives it to him. In chapter 1, Habakkuk complains. In chapter 2, he begins to change as God answers his question. And in verses 2 and 3, God says, I'm giving you a message and I want you to write it down. And then I want you to take that message that you've written down and I want you to give it to messengers to give to my people. And this vision that I'm giving you, it's about something that I've planned for the right time. And it's coming and nothing is going to stop it. And it's true. Even if you wonder, is this going to happen? Don't wonder. It's going to happen. Verse 4, key verse. This is the key verse. Remember, this is the verse that explains the whole book. Unlocks the puzzle of how do we deal with the problems we see in this world. He looks first at Babylon, the king. He says, behold, his soul is puffed up. It's not upright within him. Something is deeply wrong on the inside, in the inner man. And basically, what he's doing here, he's looking at one way people go through life. Like the king of Babylon. A lot of people go through life like the king of Babylon. Something's wrong on the inside. They're trusting in themselves. That's how the world gets through. You know, the world is chaos, so much suffering. A lot of the world gets through like the king of Babylon. They trust in themselves and they go out and they take advantage of other people. That's not the answer to Habakkuk's problem. That's not how we as God's people should respond to what we see. That's not how the righteous survive. How do the righteous survive? Habakkuk says, the righteous shall live by his faith. And really what God's telling Habakkuk, okay, so stop and think. Make sure you've got your basic principles right. Apply the principles to the problem. And after doing all that work we already mentioned, as you try to process the difficulties you see about what's happening in the world right now, and you're still in doubt like Habakkuk was, wait, God, then what do? You commit yourself to relying on God in faith. The righteous shall live by faith. Don't be so arrogant. Don't be puffed up and think you can explain everything, or you have the right to be the judge of God. The righteous shall live by faith. He's describing a group of people who stand in contrast to others. Others are living puffed up. The righteous are living by faith. And this is, like I said, the key verse to Habakkuk. Now, there's two ways to translate the word faith. You could translate it, it's the same word, but one word can be translated two different ways. And so one meaning is faith, and the other meaning is faithfulness. So like a life that's characterized by trustworthiness. The New Testament tells us which way to translate this word, of course. Romans 1:17, faith. Faith. Paul quotes this verse, and he applies it and talks about it as faith. So the righteous shall live by faith. But of course, what does faith produce? Trust in God produces trustworthiness. Faith produces faithfulness. And this is actually how Hebrews chapter 10, verse 38 helps us understand this passage. Hebrews 10, verse 38. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls. Actually, there he's trying to apply Habakkuk as well. Habakkuk 10:38 says, "My righteous one shall live by faith, and if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him." We're not those who shrink back. We're those who have faith. And what does faith do? It produces faithfulness. We preserve our souls. And then in chapter 11, he describes faith/faithfulness. So it's kind of hard. People make a big deal out of Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4. Does it mean faith or faithfulness? But really, it's hard to separate faith and faithfulness, isn't it? We live by faith. We have faith, and if we have faith, we live by faith. And that's how we deal with the suffering that we see in the world. That's sort of the key. That is not even sort of, it is the key that unlocks the puzzle. And obviously this is a verse that's used in the New Testament. The righteous shall live by faith, but it also has Old Testament roots, actually. It goes all the way back to Genesis 15. And Abraham marks the beginning of the new Jewish nation, and he's given a promise from God, and he believes, Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, and it's counted to him as righteousness. And Abraham, you remember, was coming out of what country when God called him? Ur of the Chaldeans, Babylon. And so it's almost here like Habakkuk is saying, okay, you're worried about Babylon. Babylon is this wicked nation. Babylon's going to take Israel into exile. How did Abraham get out of Babylon? Faith. God's saying to Abraham when he calls him out of Babylon, he's saying, you're coming out from the Chaldeans, and if you want to get into the covenant, what's required? Faith. You need a faith that God accounts to you as righteousness. That's how you get into the covenant. That's how you were brought into the people of God and brought out of Ur of Chaldees. And what do you have here? Habakkuk is saying, you're going out. God's going to take you out. He's judging you by the Babylonians. You're going back to where Abraham came from. What do you need to get out of there? A righteousness that comes by faith. Now, as I said, what makes it tricky is that the word faith here is also the word for faithfulness, but Habakkuk was a master literary craftsman, so he's making parallels. In the beginning, he's talking about a proud person, and what is a proud person? Here, a proud person is someone who trusts in his own military might. So even if you look at the word as faithful, you have to ask, what is the faithful person in contrast to the proud person? A faithful person is someone who continually trusts in God. The proud person trusts in his own might. The faithful person trusts in God. So it is faithfulness. You could say it's faithfulness, but it's faithfulness to what reality? It's faithfulness to the reality of trusting in God. It's not just a one-moment act of believing and then you do things on your own. No, it's that you always depend on Yahweh to act for you. That is what makes you righteous. So this is important. He's speaking to Israel. They're going into exile. And he's saying, God, what do I say to these people? How are we supposed to understand this? It looks so messed up. This terrible nation is now winning this great battle over us. And God says to Habakkuk, tell them, faith is what got you into the covenant. The faith that got you into the covenant is the faith that's going to get you out of exile. Faith that got you into the land is the faith that gets you out of exile. And this is the thing, out is not just a few people coming back into the land after exile. It's the fulfillment of all those great Old Testament promises. And that's why Paul warns the people that are in the land in Acts chapter 13. Listen, be careful how you respond to this message about Jesus, because God is at work through Jesus. And he cites Habakkuk 1:5 in Acts chapter 13. And he's saying, Israel, I'm talking to you. If you don't listen to me, you're going to still be in exile. We're still in the Habakkuk situation now. So you know the solution, Paul's saying, because Habakkuk told you. Trust. Believe. That's the answer. Now in chapter 2, verse 5, he doesn't just stop with believe. He starts explaining. God begins explaining how he's going to actually deal with Babylon. Babylon's proud, and there's a contrast here to the person who lives by faith. And the first part of the verse is a little strange, but basically Babylon was having a party at this point. They were thinking they were unstoppable. They were so proud, and so they loved to get drunk. And you can imagine this nonstop party. They think they're so strong, and that's one characteristic of a person who doesn't live by faith. They live for pleasure now. And this is going to end up being their downfall, God tells Habakkuk. They won't be satisfied. And he's talking about Babylon now. And he says their greed is like death. Death is never satisfied. The greed of Babylon, they can never have enough. So they just keep going through the world, conquering peoples. But chapter 2, verse 6, the very people that they conquer are going to end up mocking them. Shall not all these take up their taunt against him with scoffings and riddles for him? And what's the song that they're going to sing? Woe to him who heaps up what is not his own. And God says what Babylon took from others is going to be given back. He uses kind of a metaphor here. Will not your debtors suddenly arise, and those who awake who will make you tremble? Because you've plundered many nations, all the remnants of the people shall plunder you. It's like they were borrowing from others to make themselves rich. Of course, they weren't really borrowing, they were taking. But you imagine God saying, it's as if by taking, you're becoming indebted to all these other nations. And what's going to happen? The time is going to come when the nations that Babylon borrowed from are going to rise up against them. It's like a person, Babylon's like a person taking on more and more debt. And finally, the person they owe calls it in. It's time to pay back. And that's what's going to happen to Babylon. He's saying, these people that you took all these spoils from are going to come and take you as their spoil. It's a reversal. And obviously, this is revenge. For you have plundered them. Because you've plundered them, they will plunder you. And God is answering Habakkuk's question. How can I use Babylon? You're wondering, how can I use Babylon? I can use Babylon because I have a long-term plan that doesn't end with Babylon. They're just going to be here for a moment, and then they're going to be punished as well. I'm going to pick them up and use them, and then I'm going to punish them. And then in verse 9, he describes them some more, talking about their injustice, how they did evil because they were so greedy, and they felt secure because they were so powerful. Verse 9, woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to set his nest on high, to be safe from the reach of harm. Here they just think that they're taking care of themselves, that they're taking care of their family by taking from others, but what's the result? They're actually devising shame for their family. It's like they're stealing from others to build a house for their family, using other people as the bricks and stones that make up the house, and there's this time coming, God says, when those bricks and stones are going to cry out against them and turn on them. It reminds me of Psalm 73, what's happening here. You remember all those complaints in Psalm 73 about the wicked? And then finally, verses 16 and 17, where does the psalmist begin to find hope? He says, I discern their end. And what God's telling Habakkuk, the way we survive as we look at this world and all the wickedness is through faith, not thinking we know it all, but trusting what God says. And specifically, our faith needs to take the long-term view. We need to remember that God is not just trapped in this moment like we are. He has a plan. 12 and 13, he continues to pronounce woe. Woe to him who builds a town with blood. Here they're trying to build a town, a kingdom for themselves on blood, on iniquity. And the result is all this work, all this building of these towns and cities was part of God's plan to actually to actually exalt himself. And because it was part of God's plan, because God was using Babylon, they should have been more careful about how they did what God was calling them to do, but they weren't. And so God decided that all that work that they did to build these towns and cities was what? Going to be destroyed by a fire. Verse 13. Behold, is it not from the Lord of hosts that the peoples labor merely for fire and nations weary themselves for nothing? It's like they're going to build up this great house and then God's going to burn it down. They weary themselves for nothing. Why? Verse 14. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as waters cover the sea. What's happening here? Habakkuk, God's bringing Habakkuk back to the most basic reality as he struggles to understand what is going on. God has a long-term plan. God is sovereign. And as you're looking at wickedness seeming to win, take a step back. God is going to judge the wicked, but he's not just going to do that. He's going to do that for the purpose of accomplishing something better. The whole earth is going to be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea, which is similar to other prophets like Isaiah 11:9. And it's a beautiful picture if you've ever been to the ocean. The ocean completely covers the land, and he's saying the knowledge of the glory of the Lord is going to fill the earth like that. That's the plan. And so when you see seemingly wicked, or when you see wicked people seemingly winning, no, it's only going to last for a short while. God has a big, big plan to fill this earth with his glory. And so Habakkuk, God, as he's speaking to Habakkuk, continues to pronounce condemnation on the wicked. And he talks about these selfish people who make his neighbors drink in order to shame their neighbors. You woe to him who makes his neighbors drink. You pour out your wrath and make them drunk in order to gaze at their nakedness. They want to humiliate their neighbors. Woe. And why are these people condemned? Because God's going to do to them what they've done to others. You will have your fill of shame instead of glory. Drink yourself and show your uncircumcision. What you thought was going to bring you glory is actually going to end up bringing you shame, because God's going to make you drink his wrath and he's going to expose you. And these are tough verses, but remember the context. Habakkuk's saying, God, why? Could you use Babylon? Why are the wicked seeming to win? And God says, look, Habakkuk, I have a long-term plan, and I am going to judge perfectly these evil nations. And of course, Babylon here is just an example. This is where all the wicked are headed. Those who live their lives not by faith, but by trusting in themselves. Those who are greedy, those who are unjust, those who are violent, those who are selfish. What's going to happen? The violence they have done to others will be done to them. And ultimately, what's the real problem with the world? Why are they going to experience this judgment? Well, Habakkuk tells us in verse 18, it's because they trust in idols, not in God. What profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it? A metal image, a teacher of lies. For its maker trusts in his own creation when he makes speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise. Can this teach? Behold, it's overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all in it. And so this is like a watch out. It's a watch out to Babylon. You have these things that make you feel safe, that you're trusting, but what good are they? You made it, but it lies to you. You trust in it, but it has nothing to say to you. It's dead, and it's like Habakkuk, or God, is mocking them. But what about all these things we trust in, you know? In a world like this, we're still tempted not to live by faith, but to live by trust in the work of our own hands. And it's foolish. It's foolish. Especially when we look at the God who actually exists in verse 20, but the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. And I think this is so beautiful, because watching Habakkuk, he starts out complaining, and his complaints get more difficult. He's not really moving forward until there's revelation from God. And that revelation begins with, Habakkuk, you need to trust. You need to trust me. Don't be proud. Trust me. And then he starts seeing how God's going to be faithful and righteous as he judges the wicked. And what's happening? He's getting his eyes on God. He's getting his eyes on God's great plan. And he's changing. And that's the same for us. That's the same way it works for us as we're struggling with our doubts. We need to slow down. We need to think about biblical principles. We need to apply those biblical principles to our situation, to our problem. And then we need to put our trust in God. And where does that take Habakkuk in chapter 3? It takes Habakkuk exactly where it should take us, and that is praise. Chapter 3, verse 1 and following is one of the great prayers of the Bible. It flows out of the Lord being in his holy temple. Habakkuk began by asking God, where are you? And he's come to this point by the end of chapter 2 where he says, God, where are you? You're in your temple. You are right where you've always been. You're on your throne. You have a plan. And now he's on his knees. He's offering up a prayer, really probably a prayer that is meant to be a song that we sing. And he's showing us what faith looks like in the middle of chaos as he writes down this song. He's giving you a song you can sing to help you put your trust in God. He says, "Oh Lord, I've heard the report of you." A change has taken place, because what did he say in chapter 1, verse 2? He said, "Oh Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear?" But now he says, God, he's saying there, God, you won't answer me. And God's answered. He said, God, you're not working. But now he says, God, you are working. Your work, oh Lord, I do fear. So there's been a transformation. He sees this violence. He realizes that God's judging through Babylon. He understands what God's going to do in Babylon. He sees what's coming and what God's going to do to Babylon. And that changes what he's asking God now, really. And this is a mark of humility if you look at what he says. But also, if you compare these two prayers, as one man says, the first prayers were not entirely bad. If we're free to come to God at any time of the day or night or on any day of the week to voice what's in our hearts and minds, then we're certainly free to ask the kinds of questions that Habakkuk asked. But something happened in the middle between the prayers of the first chapter and the prayer of the third, and it changed Habakkuk. Quite simply, Habakkuk had taken his mind off himself, the Israelites and the Babylonians, and focused on God. So long as he was operating on a merely human level, the difference between the relative goodness of Israel and the relative badness of the Babylonians seemed great. He could ask, why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? But once he looked to God, once he saw the righteousness of God and reminded himself of the eternal and sovereign God he worshiped, these differences faded into insignificance, and the relative goodness of Israel seemed unimportant. And this is so important when it comes to praying. We come to God with our ideas. We ask our questions, but we have to look at God and think about God even as we pray. And that transforms us. That gives us peace. And that even changes our questions. And we can start asking questions rightly. And so what does Habakkuk begin asking God? He begins asking God, revive your work. He looks back at all that God has done to save Israel. And he says in verse 2, do it again. Don't just let us stay here. In the midst of the years, make it known. Over the years ahead, help your people see how you're working in the middle of this coming judgment. He wants a revival. He wants understanding. He wants the people to know God and to know what God's doing. And then he says, in wrath, remember mercy. Punish sin, God, please. But don't forget us. And really, he's just throwing himself on the mercy of God. That's his prayer. Lord, work. I know you're working. Work. And remember, even as you punish sin, to show mercy to us. And now the answer, in verses 3 and following, is one of the greatest visions of God in the Old Testament. As we are going through tough times on our knees, we need to go through difficult times on our knees humbly, wrestling. And as we wrestle, we need to look at God and consider God and cry out to God to reveal himself to us. And as we come to really know God, We come to know him by looking at what he's done in the past. And as we look at what he's done in the past, that enables us to see who he is in the future. And that's really what is going on in Habakkuk here. He says, revive your deeds, God. And then he starts thinking about some of God's deeds. And he says, God came, and he's talking about the way God rescued Israel from Egypt. And he uses pictures and language from the Exodus about what God has done in the past, and that gets him excited. Looking back on the way God rescued Israel in the past gives him confidence looking forward. And he basically says, God, you saved this way, so God, I know you will save. And really, Habakkuk here, as he sees this glorious picture of God in verses 3 through 16, what impact does it have on him? Habakkuk, he's a real person here. He sees this great vision of God. And in verse 16, he says, I'm hearing what God's doing. And what impact does it have on him? His body trembles, his lips quiver. He says rottenness enters into his bones, his leg trembles. Why? He's understanding. He's understanding the way God works. It's judgment and then salvation. Judgment has to come so that God can come in salvation. That produces real fear in Habakkuk. God's plan. God has a plan. At the beginning, chapter 1, he didn't think God had a plan. Now he looks at God, he sees, of course, God has a plan, but that plan is heavy. It's so different than chapter 1, verse 2. God, why don't you hear? God, why aren't you doing anything? God, why do I care about this more than you? No, he sees God. God does care. God cares way more than Habakkuk ever could have imagined, and God is going to judge. And that causes Habakkuk, as he trembles, as he fears, as he worships, that causes Habakkuk to make a commitment in verses 17 through 19. Some of the most beautiful verses in all of Scripture. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive oil and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herds in the stall. Basically, he's saying, look, after seeing God, now I know, even if we are brought under God's curse, I mean, all those are images of prosperity. If everything goes wrong, if we're cursed by God, how am I going to respond? What is the response of faith? I'm going to respond in faith. What does the response of faith look like? Verse 18, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. In spite of what I see, I will take joy in the God of my salvation. That seems impossible. How are you going to do that? Verse 19, God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. This book is written so long ago, but the questions it asks are so relevant today, and it shows us the way forward. We look at what's happening in this world. We begin to wonder, God, what are you doing? Things feel like a burden to us. How are you going to respond? You need to go back to God's word, and you need to soak in God's answer, which is humble yourself. God is at work. Trust God. Look and make sure you understand God's plan. Believe God. Pray, and specifically as you pray, reflect on the character of God. Think back to how God's been faithful in the past, with an eye to how God will be faithful in the future. And what's that going to do? It's going to produce fear, like a fear of God. It's going to produce trust in God, and it's going to enable you to rejoice in God, even when things are difficult, because you depend on God's strength and on God's faithfulness to his promise.